I am a data governance manager at CBRE Investment Management. My role there primarily is focused on metadata and reference data management, but we're a very small team, which should not be surprising to really anyone on this call. So I'm also responsible for aspects of data quality and largely our data strategy and our data governance strategy for the organization. This talk today is a modification of a session I presented at Data Governance Information Quality back in June. That's how Katina and I met. And as a spoiler alert for anyone who is attending the conference on the East Coast in DC in December, I'll be presenting a version of this as well, tweaked slightly based on some of the feedback I got from that June session and perhaps from some of the feedback that comes out of today's talk as well. So what will we be discussing today? Essentially 3 topics. The first is types of data governance communication. The second is why communication matters at all stages of your program, and frankly, not just for governance, but really for any of the concepts or projects we may be working on. And then finally, we'll dive a bit deeper into this clear concept. So some ways that you can take some of these little anecdotes or sound bites and use them to really make communication front of mind for you and to put it into practice as quickly as today or tomorrow. So I want to start off with basically asking you to reflect on these questions. I'm not going to hold anybody accountable. You can kind of just ruminate on this yourself, but answer these questions. How often are you truly communicating about governance? When was the last time that you did any sort of widespread communication? Do you have a data governance story? Do you have a value proposition? Would you say that you have a brand for your data governance program, or maybe even if it's not a program, for the project or initiative that you're working on? Is someone else telling your story? This is one that I think becomes really important and resonates with a lot of people that I talk to about this topic. So often the work that we're doing in the governance space is told by others. We're grateful for people who are involved in the initiative, sharing our stories, but it's really something that we want to own and we should own as part of our data governance strategy. Is it part of your roadmap? Is it part of something you're prioritizing regularly? And then finally, is it truly a priority? I think when you start to reflect on that, most of us would say to ourselves, it's likely not. It's one of the first things that falls off as part of the day-to-day. We get lost in the shuffle. There's so many other aspects of what we're focused on that communication is something that falls by the wayside. So with that said, let's talk a little bit more now about the types of data governance, or really any communication, but we'll focus a bit more on data governance. So I break this up into 2 categories, essentially. The first is what I call specific updates. So these are the things that we tend to be particularly good at. They're calls to action. They're specific updates about projects you're working on, or they're what I would call the keeping the lights on aspect of any of these given data governance projects, tasks, initiatives. They're kind of built into the projects that we're working on, and they tend to be more front of mind because they're related to some of the tactical day-to-day aspects of the projects we're working on. Certainly what we're going to talk about today is relevant to these types of updates, but want to spend a bit more time on the left side of the screen, which is what I'm calling more general awareness types of communication. These are the areas that we tend to forget about, that we tend to fail to prioritize, but where we have, I think, the most opportunity to get some quick wins and to really turn it into a long-lasting aspect of our data governance strategy and roadmap. So these are things like upfront, consistent messaging about topics, such as whether it's roles and responsibilities, basic foundational concepts, or acknowledging where you're working effectively in the business, whether it's within your team or with other people across the organization. We like to call them the heroes, those who are playing a crucial role in data governance implementation, but maybe aren't being recognized for that work, or you want to do a better job of recognizing them. Essentially, the left side of the screen is one that, like I said, I think most often winds up falling by the wayside in our day-to-day. Because we're so focused on the tactical, we're less focused on this sort of communication. And that's going to be the topic that we discuss most today. Like I said, it's very likely that the concepts we're talking about in terms of clear communication apply to both sides of the screen. We clearly need both. We need those specific tactical updates, as much as we need awareness communication, as you can see in the center, to foster that data-driven program and to drive buy-in, to encourage bi-directional communication from the business, from technology, and from the data governance function. But I think it becomes incredibly clear to us, pun not intended, that this left side of the screen is the one where we've got the most work to do as governance professionals. So if we talk a little bit, and again, most of this is, I think, incredibly obvious, but it's a worthwhile level setting, as we said, setting the stage for this conversation. The communication really is make or break for a data governance program. And that's true for all stages, as you can see, from kickoff to business as usual, whether you're in the orientation portion of your initiative, whether you're in the onboarding portion, or whether you're in ongoing business as usual, communication is most critical. It's important for awareness, for transparency, for accountability, all concepts that are very familiar to us as governance professionals. It's also important for the data heroes to acknowledge those individuals that are helping you build your program. I think my favorite part of this slide is really that formalization piece, and it's almost the fake it till you make it, as I like to call it. It allows you to really talk the talk and walk the walk in this space by really prioritizing communication. You're formalizing your program. I think for many of us, we are small groups trying to do this without a mandate, without a clear directive in terms of business buy-in. This allows us to do that incrementally, by having continuous communication, by committing to a strategy. It helps you formalize your program, whether you're implied, whether you have implied authority or whether it is expressly provided to you by senior leadership. And lastly, I think it's important to remember that communication is so important for evolution, not revolution. This is meant to be incremental. This is not, I don't think I'm going to share anything with you today that's going to be completely earth-shattering or kind of is going to completely change your mindset. But trying to provide it in a package that gives you actionable, what I'm calling quick wins or tidbits that you can take back fairly quickly, is a nod to this concept of evolution, not revolution. These are small things that we can do fairly easily to make this front of mind and to really have an impact on the organizations in which we sit. And I think what's not surprising out of any of this is that all of these concepts essentially come back to change management. So much of what we're doing as governance professionals are aspects of change management. And something we like to say a lot in my team, and you've likely heard some form of it before, there are two things people dislike. They dislike the way things are, and they dislike change. And that puts us in a very difficult spot when we're trying to implement governance initiatives, because we're trying to change the way things are with a group of people that sometimes are not necessarily inspired or activated to be partners with us. So the goal here is that we can put some plans in place to more effectively communicate and to do all of the things you're seeing on the slide, if not more so. So we set the stage. We talked a little bit about types of data governance communication, the specific updates. We talked about the more general awareness updates, which are more so the topic of today's conversation. And we've now tied the bow around why communication in and of itself is so critical to a data governance program. But that's the stuff you likely already knew or has been front of mind and why you're here at today's session. Where I'm going to spend most of the time now is about this concept of making it clear, which is essentially 5 pieces that you can put into your process of your roadmap to essentially create more convincing communication. And you can see there at the bottom, the tagline is thoughtful, intentional communication to move from the back office to the front page of your organization. And it's really about raising that awareness. It's about the formalization. And it's about making sure that we are telling an effective story as to the work we're doing. And most importantly, that we are telling the story and we're not relying upon others to do it for us. So CLEAR is an acronym for creative, lingo-free, efficient, applicable, and regular. We'll walk through each of those in turn. But again, the goal here is that by the end of the session today, you will have one, if not more, of immediate action items that you can take back and start to put into practice fairly easily without revolutionizing your data governance program, your strategy, or your roadmap. So if we start with creative, the C in clear, this really takes two forms to me. I think it relates to the mediums in which you're communicating with your department or your organization, but it also relates to branding. So if we start with being creative in terms of leveraging multiple channels and platforms, I've got some ideas you can think about when we think about general awareness, when we think about really raising your profile and telling your story. And I'll go through them in order, and if at any time, feel free. This is meant to be a dialogue, but these are some things that I've either done in organizations I've been part of, or I've been able to adapt based on conversations that have come out of sessions like this. But topics like something called Friday 5, which is an end of week wrap up where you provide 5 fast facts regarding not just your data governance program or the work that you're doing, about other things that are happening in the organization that tie towards larger governance themes or trends. There's this concept of FYI, or did you know, which doesn't commit you to 5. I know one of the pieces of feedback I get about Friday 5 is that sometimes we don't have 5 things to say. That's okay. That's where maybe it becomes a Friday FYI, or a did you know, so you're not committing to a particular cadence. But you're trying to, again, message to the broader audience, general awareness about governance concepts, about projects, initiatives, things that will make governance seem less scary to the organization, that make these topics be a little bit more accessible. But those two formats work particularly well. The middle are the things that I think are likely the more well-known or front of mind, which are the lunch and learns or the more formal sessions where you provide a bit more information about ongoing initiatives. I want to call out for videos specifically, something that I didn't realize until recently, which is it's incredibly easy to record a PowerPoint presentation and provide voiceover to it. So we've had a lot of success in our department just creating 2 or 3 slide decks, slide presentations, and recording over it, providing some form of editorial context. You can choose video or no video, so you can just allow for voiceover, and it requires no additional tooling or platforms other than Microsoft PowerPoint. And like I said, we've had a lot of success there, just using that to send messages about, project updates, new initiatives, data governance concepts that people may not be familiar with. So we've kind of morphed this Did You Know series into a video series, and it's incredibly easy for us to manage. The benefit of something like that is that you can use it and reuse it. You can then leverage those videos on something like an information hub or an intranet, where it becomes the central location for data governance information on behalf of your team or your project. And you can leverage all of the content that you're creating as it relates to any of these other communication initiatives. And then finally, I'll touch on quarterly updates or a year in review, which very much hopefully just becomes cumulative and a aggregation of the work you've done throughout the year. But again, this is meant to be just a starting point, but it's a reminder to you that you should be creative when it comes to how you're communicating to keep it fresh and to keep people engaged. So not only does that talk about multiple channels and platforms, it also talks about things like creating a basic brand. That could be a PowerPoint banner. It can be a logo or an infographic. You can see the examples that I've highlighted here were made essentially in PowerPoint. We turn them into, at the top, you can see this is our email banner that we use whenever we're sending anything on behalf of the Data Governance Office. Our Enterprise Data Governance Office within CBRE, the larger organization, uses the branding you're seeing there. All of that was created fairly easily in PowerPoint. We've screenshotted it, and we now include it in any of our communication. There are some groups that like to create mascots. They try to gamify data governance in some way. That really depends on your organization's culture. I can tell you in our culture, that would not get us very far. But in other cultures, that gamified communication aspect or the introduction of something like a mascot does make a big difference, and is certainly something to think about. But I think when we talk about being creative, most importantly, it's that you want each communication to feel complementary. You want the look, the feel, the terminology, and the messaging to fit together, because really here the goal is that you are slowly formalizing your program. You are making sure that it's not just something you're doing internally and not spreading the message about, but you're really putting some thought to this, which brings back, again, that formalization, and really helps you establish and grow your presence across the organization. So that's about being creative, which brings us now to Lingo-free. And I will admit, I think this is the toughest part of data governance communication, which is really making sure that we are not using industry terms, we are not using data-driven concepts and acronyms, and we're speaking in language that the business really understands. This takes some time. This is something where, like I said, I think it's an area where I know I have the most room to grow, and I think it very much is an area where most governance professionals or most data professionals have the biggest gap to close, and it's around this lingo-free, simple, relatable language. This doesn't happen overnight, but I think one of the things we try to do is, as a group, we play almost buzzword bingo, where whenever we are drafting a communication, we try to see, have we fallen into some of those typical pitfalls? Are we making sure that we're trying to be as accommodating and open with the language as we can? I think there are some good resources that you can go to here. I know that I attended a session last Data Governance Information Quality Conference. Danette McGilvray, who's very well known in the data quality space, her book, 10 Steps to Data Quality, doesn't just highlight building a data quality program. I think she has a lot of incredible information around exactly this, how to more effectively speak to the why and how to do it using business speak and not data speak. There's so many materials out there. That's just one of many. But I think this is an area we have to keep front of mind. If we're going to make inroads with the business and we're going to more effectively communicate, we have to find a way of doing it where you don't need data governance or even data experience to understand the message. I think one piece of feedback I get here a lot is, if you oversimplify the language too much, then you run the risk of the business not truly understanding what you're doing. I think it's certainly a trade-off, but for most of us who are struggling with engagement across the business, paying attention to lingo-free communication is going to make business more comfortable and is going to pay off in the long run. As your program matures, as your function matures, you're naturally going to see the ability for this to shift quite a bit. But I think for many of us who are in the stages where we are a smaller group trying to gain traction, I think this is something that becomes incredibly important. Efficiency. And this is one I think that's near and dear to many of our hearts, because we can talk about why it's so important to prioritize data governance communication. But if you think back to some of those questions I asked you at Jump, this is really where one of the first things that falls off the page for us is communication, because we're just too busy. We have too many other things happening that this is something that just gets deprioritized. So really talking about 3 different ways you can be more efficient here, or to try to prioritize communication as a way of helping yourself in the long run as well. So the first is, ideally, you want to keep this communication short and sweet. You don't need to turn this into a research paper. This should be something that can be consumed fairly easily, whether it's an email blast or an update on the intranet. You want it to be super concise. And when you look at it that way, it doesn't become as difficult because you're not writing, paragraphs upon paragraphs of updates. Consider adding what we're calling a TLDR, a too long didn't read. Maybe just your update is going to be that TLDR, that very, very quick update to whether it's the entire organization in general awareness or your project stakeholders in more of the specific update format. How are you over communicating, and how are you doing it in such a way that it's short enough to keep it front of mind and making it easier for you to churn it out? The goal here is that it doesn't become a chore and you're doing things to make it much more efficient for yourself. Another way to be efficient is to look for help. Now, I realize this is something not all of us have the luxury of. I'm in the organization I sit in right now. We have a very active corporate comms and marketing department that are very engaged and involved in our initiatives, and they want to take part. in an organization I came from immediately before this role. It was a fairly large company, but we had absolutely no buy-in from corporate comms and marketing. So it looks different depending on where you're sitting, but I would certainly recommend, if you have the opportunity, reach out. In many instances, they are very, very eager, and they desire this sort of connection. They're looking for content, they're looking for materials, they want to be helpful. This is about, again, working smarter, not harder. So see if you can find help somewhere. This is where you can also potentially leverage your data stewards and your data heroes. If you're fortunate to have assigned data stewards, this is something that you can make part of their function. If you don't have data stewards and you just have some people that are aligned with governance initiatives and they're kind of naturally drawn towards this, it's a way of rewarding their engagement, of getting them a bit more promotion across the business, of raising their presence. This sort of communication allows them to do it. And absolutely worst case scenario, it's something that you can just rotate within your data governance function. If you have a small team, can you make it so that each month it's someone else's responsibility? Just so it becomes a little bit more fresh, a little bit less of a chore. It's something that, again, you spread the wealth there, but see where you can find help wherever possible. And the last piece to touch on for efficiency is really to remind yourself that this helps you in the long run, to use the number of communications as a potential input metric. I could talk in a whole nother session around some of the ways we all need to be better as governance professionals about tracking progress. That certainly ties into communications as well, but this is a built-in way of tracking our progress along the way. We can simply use the number of communications as a starting point. Is it the sexiest KPI we can put together for our governance programs? Likely not, but it's certainly better than nothing, and is something that's almost built into this process. And I'd also say the more you can set a schedule in advance, the less daunting this becomes. I know for my team right now, we've got it planned out mostly through the end of the year of what topics we plan to cover. They're short and sweet. Again, most of them are almost canned responses at this point that we've reformatted from our intranet or some of the other materials that we have. But again, it's about being creative and being as efficient as we can. And I think this is a reminder that it's not that hard to do it. It shouldn't be a chore if you're working smart. But the hardest part is just making sure that you're keeping it front of mind. So if we move right along, we've talked about being creative. We've talked about focusing on business speak and not data speak. We've talked about finding help wherever you can. This next piece is about making sure that it connects with your audience. And essentially, this takes many different forms. But at the end of the day, what you're essentially trying to do is to connect the dots. Now, inevitably, this overlaps to some extent with the concept of using business speak. But it's really about telling them why this matters to them, what's in it for them, what gets better, what becomes possible if we complete this initiative, if we focus on this task at hand, if we focus on this governance deliverable. And then the flip side of that, what happens if it doesn't succeed? Framing it in such a way so that it connects with individuals. It's also about celebrating small and not just big victories. This is something where you want to make sure that you're paying attention to all of the things that are happening along the way. It's not about waiting for the big bang that a new tool is rolled out or a new data governance policy has been created. It's about providing the small updates and celebrating those small victories. That gets people engaged. It gets them involved in ways where if you wait several months to communicate, they may have forgotten about it. They may have drawn their own conclusions, or they frankly just might not care anymore. So keeping it applicable, making it front of mind, that's incredibly important. Using compelling titles is helpful. So we talked about the Fast Five or the Friday Five or the Did You Know, creating some sort of branding. These are things which, again, might seem a little obvious or seem a little kitschy or gimmicky, but these are the sorts of things that do tend to connect. It's something where, again, it's going to be different for every culture in the same way that I said, mascots and gamification work for some cultures and not others. This applies to some of these aspects as well. If you've got an email overload culture, you might want to move more towards an intranet or a knowledge hub where you can point people to it. You can figure out what that looks like. If you have a culture that's used to consuming all of this information through email, these sorts of fast five headlines and things like that become incredibly effective. There's also the opportunity to get people involved, whether it's quizzes or challenges. I was talking to someone at the conference in June, and they were saying that they put Easter eggs or little hidden gems in their communications and see who can gather the most. And then they basically do like a $25 Starbucks gift card at the end of the month to see who's compiled the most or who's responded to the most quizzes or challenges. These are rather small incentives, but they get people excited and engaged in ways that actually drive more organic buy-in for your program. And finally, I think the most important thing is wherever possible, tell a story. This was incredibly impactful for me. This is a quote from a behavioral scientist and a marketing professor at Stanford, which has done intense kind of research in this area and has found that stories are remembered up to 22 times more than facts alone. So wherever possible, if we can turn this into not just a formulaic or robotic, setting your watch to an exercise, but trying to tell a succinct story about what changed, what connected for someone. I know we, as an organization right now, my team, when we roll out a new initiative or when we're doing any sort of this regular communication, some of the key individuals we work with, we'll hopefully try to pull a quote from them. If we can't, we will try to create a quote and have them approve it. That becomes the standout. That becomes more of a story rather than us just retelling what happened or providing a bit of a summary, but to turn it into a story, going back to why this became a targeted initiative, what problem it solved, and how it made a difference. To do it in ways of bringing in individuals outside of the governance team, providing quotes from individuals. It becomes a much more rounded conversation, and it becomes much more impactful as it relates to the organization and as they start to take with them some of the anecdotes of your governance program. The last piece is about being regular. This is about data governance communication, but I'd argue it's actually about data governance over communication. This is about messaging early and often and maintaining a cadence. So setting that schedule, number one, so that it becomes less daunting for you, so that you can be more efficient, but also so the organization just starts to become accustomed to this level of communication. I think this cartoon is incredibly relatable for me, and I think many others on this call. We can think that something is entirely clear, but how it's perceived by the organization may look and feel very different. And it's only through over communication are we able to make an impact and to make sure that our strategy, our goals, our roadmap is actually being perceived by others. And there's another fact here, which is essentially you need to say something 7 times in order for it to connect. And this isn't just in the business space. This is in the marketing space, generally speaking. So for us to remember, if you ideally need to say something 7 times, what does that mean for the concepts that we're working on, for the aspects of governance that are not always going to be front of mind for the business? If it takes 7 times in marketing, how many more times does it take for us to connect on concepts that are far into the business? So this is about creating a communication plan across all channels and platforms that we talked about in all of the different ways we can be creative. And the last thing I want to point out is this is also about timing. We talk about the Friday 5. As a group, we decided that we paused the Friday 5 in the summer because we're an organization that does summer Fridays. The holidays are a bit crazy, or the vacation schedules in our organization are not really conducive to a Friday 5 format. But we're thinking about things like that, about timing and how to best coordinate. A lunch and learn on a holiday week or on a Friday afternoon probably don't make the most sense. So just being really thoughtful about your overall strategy. Doesn't have to be perfect. This is not about over engineering any aspect of this, but it's just about being thoughtful so that you can be as impactful as possible. So if we sum it up, again, nothing here I think was incredibly revolutionary. not much. I don't think I said anything that you maybe didn't already know, but the goal is that I can now tie this up into a package for you, that it becomes a bit more actionable and the prospect of communication becomes a bit more daunting. So if we think about what we discussed today, it's that change management is incredibly important as data governance offices and functions are working to move from the back office to the front page. Effective communication is what's going to allow us to do that. And then we've talked about some of the tips that allow communication to be more effective. It's about using multiple channels and platforms so that they feel complementary, they look complementary, and they provide your program with a brand that can be as basic as a slide that you've created in PowerPoint that becomes your new logo and your new email banner. It can be as extreme as, if you truly have a marketing department, they can create a sleek branded logo for you. But it's something you can do fairly easily to be creative in terms of your communication. It's about avoiding language that requires data experience to understand. It's looking for and finding help in the right places so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can leverage individuals that are already prioritizing this function or already willing and able to help you. It's about telling a story for all the reasons we talked about. It's more likely to be remembered. It's more likely to be impactful. And it just generally reads better. It's much more interesting to read a quick kind of newsletter type update from someone else's perspective rather than it is to read kind of a summary of a data governance concept or project. And then finally, this is about over communication, about spreading an effective message by really what may feel like over communicating, what may feel like at times you're doing just that. You're saying the same things over, you're being repetitive. It doesn't feel revolutionary. That's okay. It's not meant to be. It really is meant to evolve slowly over time and help your organization mature, help your governance function mature, and help close the sizable gap at times between how data professionals speak and how business professionals speak. So with that said, we've got some time for questions. Happy to discuss any and all topics, you name it, but really want to make sure that if you do have some feedback you'd like to share, if you have some questions about how this works or my experience in this function, happy to answer any questions you may have.
Hey there, do you mind if I chime in? It's me, Luigi, and I forgot to put in my last name. It's Leo, like the Zodiac. So you got a Mario brother and a Zodiac to make up my name. But I wanted to say thank you very much, and actually let me get on camera too, so that way you guys can see who I am. I wanted to thank you very much for hosting this, because everything that you're saying, I'm finding it to be very true. So I started with Envision Health doing data governance as their senior analyst, and I have a background in like program development, and so really we're lifting and shifting this into like trying to mature the program and have it become pervasive, right? Like in the best way possible. And I love that you touched on how important communication is, and I thank you for bringing that, drilling that home. I have a couple of questions I'd love to bounce off of you or the group regarding an approach that we're taking, and a little bit of, if I may say, a little bit of reservations that I'm having. We have a whole bunch of user groups that we started to start engaging data citizens and empowering them. We're at the precipice of starting like a tools user group and then like a data first culture user group. I was wondering if you had any wisdom or any insight that would allow us to make the most of these user groups through the perspective of like inspiring, inspiring participation, or some semblance of like energy or motivation for people to be there. I guess what I'm asking for is, if we do start this off, and if this is a good idea, then how do we get people hooked? I would love to hear what you have to say about that.
The hook is certainly the hardest part. I'm not going to make any bones about it. But I think it's going to be very much culture specific. And that gamification concept, works in so many organizations. I know in the investment management organization, there's just no appetite in my space for any of that. It's just an eye roll. I know it. We've tried it. They're uninterested. But incentives. So, prizes for the most number of attendance, prizes for, the smallest, anything that you can measure, providing some sort of incentive around it does become a game changer, especially when you're doing it at kickoff, because you're going to identify those individuals that are already engaged and are looking for a reason to completely buy in. If you can get them from jump at that orientation phase, I think you're going to be the most successful. So you're at a perfect time now if you are going to be ramping that up. I think that concept of, it doesn't have to be truly a game, but finding some way to get them bought in. And I think that concept of formalization, to me, people want to trust that this is a well-designed, well thought out program. So even as basic as providing, when you're messaging, a email template letterhead, it looks and feels different. It feels very much thoughtful, intentional, and it's almost the fake it till you make it that I like to say. Even if you don't really know what you're doing and you're trying to get this off the ground in whatever the user group or the whatever function it is, I think it inspires confidence in almost subconscious ways, and it's incredibly easy to implement. So those would be my two things, would be formalize it as much as you can in the look and feel, make sure that you're consistent in how you talk about these terms and create a basic banner or something that, again, feels very official. And then see if you can hook people early with some basic incentives. It's like a $25 gift card, or it's a pizza party, or it's something that gets people interested in the initiative early. And you can identify who, whether they're formally identified or just the heroes, as we like to call them, you can identify those people quickly and you can capitalize on their engagement.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you validating a couple of things and also inspiring others. Thank you again for hosting the call.
Sure thing.
Thank you. Great question. I think Michelle, you had your hand raised.
Oh, yes, I did. Let me open up. I had a question about how does the data governance, people are talking about data literacy programs as well as with data governance. How do you have both? Do you integrate both? How do you do both? And second question is, do you have a communications department that helps you out with some of this stuff?
The literacy question, I think, is great. Our function right now does not have, like, it's clearly on our roadmap. We want to work towards it, and we want it to sit almost parallel to the governance function because we see it as broader than just governance. But right now, it's governance as a proxy for literacy. I think anything that we've talked about today certainly becomes applicable to the literacy program as well. I tend to think of literacy as a bit more mature of an organization in terms of their growth. So inevitably, I would think that literacy would have its own communication strategy. But I don't see this as specific to governance by any means. And I think that the struggles that we have as governance professionals or in governance programs to connect and to bridge those gaps apply just as much to literacy. So I think it's totally applicable. I think, again, not that they're going to be interconnected. So I see that, again, I would love it if we had specifically a literacy program. We're not there yet, but I think it has to be a foundation of a literacy program in the same way for a governance program.
Okay. And for a communications department, do you have a general communications department in your organization that helps you out with some of the writing and stuff like that?
So unfortunately, no. So we have a marketing department, but they're focused almost exclusively on external communications.
Okay.
So we leverage them for like the basics. So if we, like, in the same way when I attended the conference and spoke, they were very eager to say, okay, let's publicize the fact that you're speaking at the conference, but we do not get buy-in from them internally. It's just the nature of what they're trying to do. In their mind, they're meant to be more external facing than internal focused. But we did work with them a bit. Again, where we landed was not at all, I think, where they could have helped us. and some of that branding and those materials, and that's why we just landed on PowerPoint. But I don't know that that's the case in all organizations. I think there are plenty of orgs that really do leverage the internal comms and internal marketing. For us, though, just on the basis of what we do and being so client and investor focused, they're always looking outside.
Okay.
And unfortunately, we're not able to leverage them as much as I'd like.
Okay, that's good to know. It's good to hear somebody's perspective on that. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Of course.
Great. Okay, we have a couple of questions that came up in the chat. It says, curious to hear your thoughts on the data owner role for organizations that already have data stewards and data governors. Does it make sense to have data owners, and why?
Data owners are something we struggle with, at least I'll speak for my organization. I think the concept of ownership scares a lot of people. They don't necessarily want to be responsible. I think any one of those challenges, like whether you call them data stewards or data ambassadors, data governors, I think that has its own can of worms. But once you elevate it into the ownership category, I see it twofold. In our org, we see people who see themselves as the be all and end all deciders as it relates to whatever the data in question is. And then I see people that are totally resistant to accepting that title and don't want any of the stress that comes along with it. I think the challenge is trying to decide on the right names. And it very much ties into this communication conversation as well. It's about making people comfortable and making them more willing to embrace change. So I know historically I have not had success with data owners. I think in practice, you do need them. You need individuals that are incentivized and really empowered to assert some control and decision-making authority over the data in question. But I think it becomes a very double-edged sword where people are either scared of the responsibility or are power drunk with the responsibility that comes along with it. So I don't have a perfect answer for you there, but I think the names of those roles and the responsibilities associated with them is incredibly important for any program and ties into your communication strategy as well.
Yes, agreed. Very much so. Okay, another question from John. Says, your presentation addresses comm strategy for overall programs. Are there specific different tactics you'd use for projects, like picking resonant code names?
Yeah, I think that is something where we have a lot of success in the org at the more tactical kind of the specific updates we're providing. We get a lot of traction just with, and when I joined the org a year ago, it was the part that I found the most interesting, where using things like Project Gemstone became so people were excited to work on it and it resonated in some way, even though it provided no context. So to me, it was an incredibly useless name because I didn't have any, I needed a lexicon to figure out what these different projects were doing, but it's certainly connected in the organization. So I think, again, it's not a silver bullet. I can't provide every sort of, that's the beauty of these sessions is like I can incorporate something like that now in the next conversation that we have. It very much is like a living and breathing conversation based on all of this feedback. But I think that's one thing is those project names. I think it's trying to do whatever you can to get people like authentically and organically excited. I realize that is an incredibly difficult concept for a lot of the projects we work on, especially because we are often kind of underfunded and under-resourced. But I think those are the sorts of things that are incredibly helpful. And code names or project names is another idea that I really like that example. And I'm going to include that in the next version of this talk, because I do think that is a fairly easy way that you can connect with the organization.
Yeah, agreed. We had one well, not recently, a few years back. It was a huge, project within the organization, and we actually had jerseys that were made up, right, that we all had for it. So everyone's on the team. We're all on the team, right? That team focus. Great. Anybody else have any questions? Want to chime in? Feel free to unmute and ask Valerie anything you'd like.
I'm sorry, guys, and this is just me multitasking, so I do apologize. There were a couple of questions in the chat. Did we acknowledge those already?
Yes, we did.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
Mhm.
Yeah. And yep, right there with my pants down. Sorry, guys.
Okay.
So the only question that I do have, this last one, is I heard that, I think, Valerie, you just spoke to the point of our programs are very lean, sometimes from a resource standpoint, sometimes from a budget standpoint. I'm finding the more that I do this, the more passionate I'm becoming about the impact that we have. And this is me showing my inexperience, but I'd rather be vulnerable with you guys, so I learn, through the experience of others. Why is it that we're so instrumental to the success of an organization through a lens of data, and yet so underfunded, so lean? I don't understand the dichotomy there, and I'd like to be sobered up, if I'm honest.
I'm happy to take a stab. Like, I think to some extent from my experience is that there's still a disconnect with the business. Like, I've never worked in an organization that had a chief data officer. It's a business function. It's a function that the business just doesn't understand. In some instances, it's perfunctory. They know that they need a governance function. It's a cost of doing business, but they don't actually understand how to resource it, how to fund it. And it's still a maturing concept. So I think some of it is just because the business, frankly, is not there yet. It's the reason why there's so much money to be made by consultants in this space, because the C-suite doesn't fully understand, I'll say in many organizations, the impact of data and the reach of data. And I think it's still a maturing function. So I think that's at least my 2 cents on this, is that until the business fully understands, or more specifically, until the C-suite fully understands data, it's going to continue being lean, at least from my perspective.
Can I chime in just from a library perspective? Because I did corporate libraries a long time ago. They ran into the same problems because it was very lean, and some of it is kind of like gone by the wayside. And basically because they weren't generating revenue, it was one of the big problems. The only way they could really get the funding is through the metrics.
Yeah, I'll echo that. The lack of support comes from a lack of understanding of the value that's being delivered. And I would argue that, well, we all understand that good data governance translates directly to the bottom line. Folks who are making that investment in what is conventionally seen as sort of a administrative overhead type of function, don't see it, right? So if you can show, for example, with data quality, hey, data governance fixed this data quality problem and it made you, more effective with your win rate on sales, or it lowered the cost of this one process, or it reduced confusion and boosted, your customer satisfaction or whatever. If you can tie it to some metrics, I think that is a really good way to try to get some traction. And that ties back into what Valerie was saying about sort of starting small and moving up from there. If you can pick if you can find the biggest data mess in your organization and apply governance to it and get some real visible wins, then it goes a long way to helping, if nothing else, kind of stabilize your funding, right, and your investment, and then maybe even start growing from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I echo that as well. It's finding those metrics, and every organization is different. And I think the key that I found is, based on your organization, if you're having a struggle there, not only is a metric such as quality, but also where's the risk? What's going to get the attention of those in the C-suite that they'll want to put the money and they want to put the attention behind it. You've got to have that stakeholder that's going to support you and have the buy-in and help champion it. So it's finding that champion and, that helps drive it. And a lot of times it's identifying, not only metrics like that, such as quality, but also risk. And risk tends to speak, unfortunately, louder. It's like John's got a raised hand.
Yeah, I wanted to reemphasize, first off, that's a great comment. I'm a product manager, not a data person, and I'm here as a product manager. But you should hold your product managers accountable for making sure that the data projects you're on are making them more effective. And I'll give you a concrete example. Without data quality initiatives and without an effective metadata management program, we've had situations where data from multiple sources can take days to update a record that goes to optimize search results to help people acquire the products that we sell. And we had a data management program that reduced that down to 15 minutes. And that was a quantifiable result that we could say it showed availability for our products that was up to date to people who were purchasing them. And that was a data management, data governance program that went to the bottom line effectively. And that was information I had as a product manager on how effective this was from that helped the data governance person justify their job. So hold us accountable when you're doing things for us, and make sure we put goals for you in our programs.
That's amazing. And honestly, it speaks right to one of the challenges of our program is demonstrating value. And so now, I mean, whether or not this is the forum for it or being this transparent, it could bite me in the butt, but like, I think value engineering is going to be like super important to actually define the parameters. So that way, when we do come up with, when we do sort of socialize these tool sets and or solutions and capabilities that we're showing the before and after, that kind of leads into my other question. And this is kind of a solicitation of like, yes, I do, and no, I don't. Does anybody on this call have their value propositions it rather has a very strong value proposition game in terms of we know how to get ahead of this to show our value, and maybe you wouldn't mind mentoring. Like, it would be awesome just to learn, because I'm learning as I go, and I have an engineering background, but it's different in this space. And so if anyone wants to chime in or reach out to me separately, please let me know. I'd love to have conversations. Hey, Michelle.
I was writing an article about Donna Burbank, and she's an expert at this subject. And she was basically saying a couple of things. One is actually you can get some more positive. You can play off the offensive, the data, like, hey, I'm going to be saving you more time for your marketers or for your investors, so they don't have to go through all this problem of getting this information by having this data governance, because they're going to be able to find this, they're going to be able to have the metadata, that sort of thing. The other thing is always to put in with the slide or any presentation, she should suggest the cost of not doing anything, to make that visible, because if it's not visible, because you know what it is, but if it's not visible, it somehow slips out of the radar. I'd be happy. It's just sent in the article last month, so I'd be happy to if you're interested, I'll leave you my email, and then I can let you know when the link's out. The presentation is all like video and everything. I could share that too.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, that would be huge.
Okay.
Thank you guys for allowing me to ask these novice questions. Appreciate it.
They're not novice. Everybody's having trouble with them.
Tina, I think you muted.
You are right. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's great questions. And I was just saying that, we're all in this journey together, right? Some of us are a little further along than others. And so that's the whole point, is to come here and have those discussions. And it's great. I think this has been great feedback. Hopefully, for you, Valerie, and answering some questions. And, it's spawned some other ideas for us on topics that we can continue to present for the groups. And so we can, see from this engagement, what are people interested in? What do we need to talk about more of, and take them from there. But we are definitely up on the hour here. Wanted to just take a moment again to thank Valerie very much for the presentation. It was a fantastic session on stuff that, again, I know she says it isn't rocket science, it's stuff we know, but it's how do we apply this, right? Bring it back home and apply it in our environments, and realize that we do speak a little bit too much data language. We got to step that back a bit and step outside our shoes and look at it from another perspective. So great information, very applicable stuff we can turn around and take, today and start making some gains on.